very generous introduction. Let me say that the more I reflected on this lecture, the more I've been struck by how alien and perhaps even destructive it may sound here in Britain. Religion and values, which is the topic which I've chosen to speak to you on this evening, have not formed part of the narrative here of the troubled relationship between Britain and the process of European integration. But if the European Union is no more than a common market, as many here believe, why should they be part of the story? In fact, these subjects, values and religion, may be seen rather as added complications to a debate by those who seek a more constructive dialogue on Europe. The result of this is that they are not much spoken of, particularly within and by the churches. I think that Cardinal Newman, who wrote so eloquently about the high protecting power of knowledge, would be disappointed in this. And while this lecture is not intended to be exclusively focused on Britain and the European Union, I will initially say a few words about this issue, if I may. Perhaps there's an unspoken suspicion that the whole business of European integration is just a little too Catholic for British tastes. Even though the religious influence of the Reformed churches, particularly in Germany, was profound in its creation and development, this wouldn't be at all visible here, whereas the founding fathers, as they're perhaps annoyingly described by Europhiles such as myself, were to a man Catholic, and committed Catholics at that. Certainly Schumann, de Gasperi and Adenauer were, and Monet was a Catholic as well. They were all Christian Democrats, basically, and only Paul-Henri Spaak, in the early European pantheon of heroes, was a socialist. But others from the Reformed tradition, more latterly the Danes, the Swedes and the Finns, had begun to think of Europe not merely as a common market, but by asking themselves the question, has it a soul? This is particularly true of some debate in Finland. It is, I think, indisputable that the United Kingdom has had a fundamental problem with European integration. The evidence of polls suggests that the negativism here is qualitatively different from all other cases, not merely in its consistency, but in its depth. Thus it remains at the lowest position in Eurobarometer polls in its positivism towards the European Union. Indeed, it's far from clear what the result of a referendum on membership would be today, but I believe, in fact, it would be carried, but not with great ease. This ambivalence has been evident from the earliest days, in the lead-up to the Treaty of Paris, coal and steel community, that started the whole process. Dean Acheson counselled the French not to tell London because of the destructive influence that this could have on the process. The reasons for the antipathy are many, varied, and understandable. It's apparent that history plays a substantial part in this, not merely through the memory of terrible continental wars, but also in the sense of distinctiveness born out of the inviolability of Britain itself, an island that hadn't been invaded for 1,000 years. Britain had pragmatic economic grounds, too, for its initial opposition to European integration. Its loyalty to and connection with an empire, already disintegrating but still connected more actively in the 40s and 50s than today. And the English-speaking peoples, as they were described, was an essential element in limiting the political debate that took place in the 50s on the whole subject of Europe. Britain, too, though impoverished by a terrible war, had won the war, had not been occupied, and was not devastated in the same way that the continent had been, thus enabling the building of new foundations from a different type of base. Winston Churchill, of course, in his famous speech in the University of Zurich on the 16th of September 1946, though extolling the virtues of a common inheritance of Christian faith and ethics and the prospect of a united Europe, saw Britain as standing apart. So the Commonwealth and the United States form part of the backdrop to this, but so too does nationalism. It's not hard to recall George Canning's remark in 1826, following the collapse of the Congress of Vienna system, that, quote, "things are getting back to a wholesome state, every nation for itself, and God for us all." God help us all, he might have said. It still has a resonance, even in this era of interdependence. In the end of the day, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Britain essentially dislikes, in principle, the sharing of sovereignty, and indeed any interference with the constitutional principle, which Dicey told us was the only good principle that counted, the supremacy of Parliament. So, even the supremacy of European law, established beyond doubt by the Factortame case in 1989, has been erroneously characterized by some figures in the establishment as an unwarranted and unjustified intrusion on their basic understanding of what they joined in 1973. In Britain, there has never been a sympathy for, or even a comprehension of, the political and indeed moral purpose of the project to pursue an ever greater union of the peoples of Europe. It has had few true advocates in the political world. And those who are pro-European, such as the distinguished Chancellor, have been coming from a position which, even in their case, is different from that of the mainstream of the Christian Democrat thinkers in the early days. And the current government appears, in the face of it, at least if one is to take the Foreign Secretary's remarks as being representative of what now is the government as opposed to what was the Conservative Party's position going into the election, is the most Eurosceptic in the last 20 years. At every revision of the treaty since accession, Britain has been reluctant, the most reluctant member state to move forward. It has always pressed for cooperation by sovereign states rather than integration by sharing sovereignty. Even the Single European Act, which enabled the creation of the single market, which Mrs. Thatcher believed in, was itself resisted in significant respects for this reason. In other words, Britain has constantly pressed for intergovernmentalism rather than supranationalism. For me, this has been a tragedy for many of us who had hoped for the leadership of Britain in another direction. It seems tragic because Britain has so much to give to the process. Its tolerance, its long-standing democracy, its commitment to the rule of law, its basic ethical content in terms of governance. The real tragedy, however, may be that a debate on the substance of the issues never seems to have taken place. In particular, the overwhelmingly Christian intellectual foundations for European integration have not been explored in a substantive manner in political circles, and academia has not been much better. The question may be asked whether the issue is in any way relevant. Following the delayed conclusion of the agonizing debate on the Lisbon Treaty and the general agreement on its adoption that further constitutional change was not on the agenda for the foreseeable future, one may say, let's not go down this road. There is no appetite for further constitutional change in Europe. This is clearly true for the majority at the moment. However, the debate, I believe, even in the absence of the trauma that we're going through in the context of Greece, is only in temporary abeyance. For one thing, it is increasingly obvious that the dynamics of globalization will demand answers to new questions as to whether Europe has a voice and whether it can express its voice as one voice. Furthermore, the issues surrounding the survival of the euro following the debt crisis will result, inevitably, in a new drive for economic governance at European level, which will undoubtedly raise issues in regard to sovereignty and in regard to the distance one is prepared to go on this path to a union of the peoples of Europe. And this argument about the future, whilst essentially about federalism, is not initially going to appear to be of great relevance to Britain being outside the Eurozone. But if you think through the consequences of this further step forward, I think it is inevitable that Britain not merely will have to legally play its role in the debate, but has a vital national interest in regard to the question as to where it goes. The word federal has taken on such pejorative connotations here in this country that it can scarcely be mentioned in polite company. And this notwithstanding the fact that for many continentals it is at the heart of the process. It's inextricably linked to maintaining the vision of its founders. Looking now for a moment at the history of European integration from a moral or ethical point of view is what I intend to do now. Of course, I don't seek to argue that European values and their survival depend upon the survival of the European Union. I merely say that in this context it is an important element. Amongst the key figures in the early days were, as I've said, Robert Schuman, Konrad Adenauer, and Alcide Gasperi. These three were ardent Catholics and came from the borders of their respective countries, Lorraine, Rhineland, and Trentino, in which nationalisms are often tempered by the ills and virtues of living together. All three spoke German. Schuman was born in the German Empire, and de Gasperi sat as a parliamentarian in the Austrian Parliament in Vienna, witnessing considerable forces labouring to make a multi-ethnic empire function. All three had witnessed a 20th century where God had been declared dead, leading to the most horrific extinction of the European ideal of tolerance, with totalitarianism bringing death and destruction to the continent. From the beginning, the European project was about far more than economic advantage. Indeed, the common market came rather late in the day. When Adenauer and Monnet met in 1950, under the auspices of the Geneva Circle, they spoke of a moral purpose. In a letter to Schuman on the 23rd of August 1951, Adenauer expressed his thoughts as follows. I quote, "I hold for a very favourable and particular sign, even providential, that all the weight of the tasks yet to accomplish rest on the shoulders of men who, like you, and as our common friend President de Gasperi and myself, are penetrated by the will to develop and realise the new construction of Europe on Christian foundations." The Catholic Bishops' Conference recently identified the core motivation of the Schuman Declaration of the 9th of May that launched the process, 1950, that launched the process as being essentially an appeal for mutual forgiveness and as such a profoundly Christian act. But however much forgiveness played a central role in motivating the founders in launching the process of European integration, the real purpose looked to the future. It was to provide a means to protect Christian values from suffering ever again from the destruction wrought upon them by the godless acts that constantly recurred in European history, and which I as an Irishman have witnessed on my own island. It was fundamentally about creating a new attitude to the concept of national sovereignty that was first articulated by Baudin's De la République of 1583. It constituted a largely Christian normative reflection on the whole concept of the nation-state, so beloved by many of our politicians, and the limits of its power. One cannot be surprised that such a noble purpose has given rise to the difficulties that it has here. Ernest Bevin dismissed the seminal Messina Conference preceding the Treaty of Rome famously as an archaeological excavation. And for fear that you may accuse me of similar current irrelevance here, let me point out that the issues surrounding the project then are in many ways the same today. They're all about values and moral purpose, at the heart of which was an openly expressed federal project based on supranational institutions. The arguments for those institutions, I believe, are as valid now as they were on the 8th of August 1950, when Monet wrote to Errol Macmillan, making clear that this was the case, and that it was the reason that he could not accept the alternative put forward by the British government, which was intergovernmentalist. This intergovernmental approach was to be the precursor of a multitude of later initiatives from London along the same lines. But European integrationists are still firmly opposed to intergovernmentalism. This is an arguable issue, of course, but I believe they're justified in this, for it is where we have had supranational institutions that we have succeeded in coming together, and where we have relied on intergovernmentalism, we have mostly failed. The federalism of the Founding Fathers was founded upon the belief that national sovereignty, constrained only from within, was not merely dangerous, but essentially evil, because it postulated a greater power than man alone can possess. Jacques Maritain, the Catholic philosopher who most influenced the process in its conception, wrote, "God alone is sovereign. This concept of sovereignty is intrinsically wrong." He had written, I think in September 1940, in the Commonweal when he was in Washington, about the necessary federalism that would have to follow the war. And insofar as Germany was concerned, he said it had two parts. Germany itself needed to be federal. And secondly, Germany had to be part of a federal Europe. Not least because of its inherent power, an issue which is not beyond relevance in regard to the future. In 1940, therefore, when he published this article, he and others began the philosophical consideration of how best we should govern ourselves and how things should develop after the war. The experiences of the first half of the 20th century had created, not by any means exclusively within the Christian Democrat Party, a number of responses to the issue of national sovereignty. All of these were intended to limit its exercise. One was the promulgation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the other conventions that followed it, one of which at least is questioned significantly in terms of the legislative framework that is going to apply to human rights in Britain. But that was one limitation. And again, Maritain had played a significant role in the Universal Declaration. Another was the institutional structure of federalism, with supranational institutions above, supported by the application of concepts which are widely debated to this day in the continent, such as personalism and subsidiarity. Personalism sought to place man in the context of relationships to society, as opposed to the atomization of individualism. In other words, it was a means to contest the excessive individualism of liberalism and the excessive collectivism of communism. It sought to recognize the dignity of the human person created by God and to present the person as having an obligation and a duty to foster values associated with his nature, including solidarity with others and community involvement. Subsidiarity completed a pincer movement with supranationalism on national sovereignty by seeking to oblige national governments to structure decision-making as close to the people as possible, something that indeed the current new government, Conservative Party in particular, has very definitely taken, without using the name, as a net relevant party policy. All of this thinking contributed to the objective of creating the social market economy, and indeed to a concept of solidarity both within the state and outside it. Solidarity is, of course, directly linked to the Christian belief that all mankind is one's neighbour. And in the EU context, community solidarity has led to the creation of various vehicles for the redistribution of wealth between states, rich and poor. The structural funds, as they are called, the regional fund and the social fund. Now, if I may say so, this again has been an area where Britain has balked, has constantly tried to cut back successfully the budget of the European Union, and basically seeks a policy of jus retour. You put in and you take out more or less the same. And this, again, to my mind, is a very important element of the Christian aspects of federalism. And certainly they're relevant in the context of the Greek issue that we are facing today. And they imply that, again, that the Union is more than a common market. We know that we have a common market. Have we got a soul? How have these original concepts and ideas fared? Well, the original ideas of the philosophers who influenced the founding fathers have remained relevant. Jacques Delors, who, with Walter Haustein, was one of the two great presidents of the European Commission, maintains that the greatest influence on him was that of the Christian socialist Emmanuel Mounier, who was particularly important in his writings between the wars and in the 30s. In his biography by Charles Grant, he spent some time talking about this subject. In 1992, as president of the European Commission, he called for a soul for Europe, arguing that if Brussels was not able to inject a spiritual dimension into the European Union, it would fail to command the allegiance of its citizens. He said, if in the next 10 years we haven't managed to give a soul to Europe, to give it spirituality and meaning, the game will be up. Well, he was always a man for slightly excessive statements, but I think in this he was making a point that he absolutely felt. The Christian Democrats, too, remain the largest party in the European Parliament and are still openly committed to the federalist idea. In its position at the convention that preceded the Lisbon Treaty, that party made the following statements: the peoples joined the integration process based on their free decision to declare their intention to create a close and federal European Union. Already the states have individually lost their ability to secure peace, external or internal security, prosperity and growth in a globalized world by acting alone. Sovereignty can only be exercised on a larger scale. Here the Christian Democrats assert, indirectly, that if European values are to inform and influence international debate, for an example, in relation to climate change, poverty, world peace, and so on, federalism is the only way to do it. One can debate this. One can argue that it can be achieved through intergovernmentalism. I would suggest that history proves that to be a very feeble mechanism for this type of activity. At European level too, the old ideas still drive policy. In 2001, for an example, the People's Party, the Christian Democrats' submission on the CAP and the WTO made explicit reference. In fact, the entire document that they submitted was built on the implications expressed under the headings of personalism, subsidiarity, and solidarity. For these reasons, I believe that the European integration process remains inextricably linked to promoting values that Christians hold dear, and that it is far more than a commercial exercise or an intergovernmental mechanism to simply advance national interests. However, it is a long way from an effective federal union, and I don't believe that that is achievable in a very short time. The most that can be said is that it is currently sui generis and partly federal. That the Conservative Party has withdrawn from the Christian Democratic group in the European Parliament may be inconvenient for both in terms of their numerical strength. But surely it's hard for the Conservatives to be part of a party whose core policies are still expressed to be federalist in intention. The Conservative Party is, as we know, resolutely opposed to them. Let me turn to another point. Whether one sees Europe as potentially federal, as I would hope, or not, and I concede that we're still on a journey here to an undefined destination, we live in a continent where many believe that although we do share values, they don't come to us from Christianity in any event. They come to us from the Enlightenment and from reason, they would say. Secularism has a number of definitions. Generally, it means that religion and its institutions are to be separated from political authority. Bernard Lewis, in his really great book, What Went Wrong, makes the point that the very idea of secularism and the separation of church and state is in fact, I quote, in a profound sense Christian. He goes on to explain this, drawing on the authoritative Christian text of Matthew 22:21, in which Christ is quoted as saying, "Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." Lewis then traces the history of this Christian position back to Rome and draws the significant distinctions with the history of Islam. Christian generally had a parallel institution in the church to the political power, which Muslim societies have never had. However, some liberal secularists in Europe and elsewhere believe, I quote, not merely that the state should not enforce, institutionalize, or formally endorse a religion, it should not be guided by religious considerations in its policies and treatment of citizens, and should in general retain an attitude of strict indifference to religion. That's a quotation from Victor Marek's book, Rethinking Multiculturalism. The argument here is that political debate should be conducted in terms of secular reasons alone. In national parliaments and the European Parliament, the differences on secularism and religion and politics are manifested regularly. One such debate took place in regard to excluding references to God in the European Constitution. The core liberal position is that in some way politicians should leave their religious convictions at the door of Parliament and agree that once inside they will be influenced solely by reason. As Charles Taylor puts it, their view is that the public world should be emptied of God. He wrote that in a secular age. Not adopting it, I should say, but repeating it. This extreme secularist case makes absolutely no sense. The value system that we generally have in Europe makes the point, I think, clearly, because Christians have in fact massively influenced it as Christians. It's not mere calculation that ultimately determines right or wrong, or the fundamental concepts of the dignity of man or the equality of man, but the basic doctrines of Christianity, which, however much abused by Christians over the centuries, paradoxically have endured in Europe because of Christianity. Indeed, they influenced profoundly the Enlightenment itself, which brought a necessary reflection and reform to Christianity. The Christian input, therefore, has remained influential, and it should not hide itself from debate or discussion in the way suggested by that appalling phrase, that Parliament should be emptied of God. One way or the other, the peoples of Europe, collectively and separately, have in fact come to the same place in regard to values because of their shared cultural heritage, experience, and religion. This is evident in their general agreement on the type of societies in which they want to live. They are all supportive of the welfare state and the broad responsibilities of society for the weak and needy, both left and right across Europe. We are all believers in multilateralism and the international treaties that provide a rule-based international society. Incidentally, going back to Maritain and Mounier, both of them were instrumental in aspects of these. We are distinguished from the United States not merely in respect of these, but in our attitudes to a diverse range of issues, from the death penalty to the length of terms of imprisonment, to gun controls, to individualism generally. Even in the Iraq War, where our government split, our peoples did not. And everywhere, in majorities, they opposed the war. But whether they did or not, the differences between Europe and the United States are there. I believe Christian thinking influenced our positions. It would be, of course, absurd to say that Christianity didn't influence theirs. But a distinction can be drawn between Europe and the United States. Even the definitions of either side, on either side of the Atlantic, of a liberal are radically different. In continental Europe, a liberal is defined in terms of freedom of the individual. A continental European liberal is therefore a believer in individual freedom, low taxation, minimum regulation. On the other hand, in the United States, a liberal is one who is broadly left, who supports redistributive policies and greater regulation. But these matters don't really count. In fact, the individualism of the United States against the personalism, as I defined it earlier, of Europe, is a defining difference between the two. Whether this is due to the enduring effects of the pioneer spirit, or even the attitude to political authority of the Pilgrim Fathers, or for other reasons, is in a sense irrelevant. What is relevant is that basically Europe has a position, and it's shared by most Europeans on most issues. It is a position that accepts the separation of church and politics, is broadly concerned with the creation of a fair society. The United States would no doubt claim a similar position, but it clearly believes in different ways to achieve a fair society to those generally approved by Europeans. Let me say a word here about rights, which in a sense are the justiciable embodiment of values. Looking to the World War II development, post-World War II development of fundamental human rights, it's striking, as I said, how many of the same Christian actors played an important role. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was significantly the creation of the Human Rights Commission, chaired for that purpose by Eleanor Roosevelt. Whilst it contained, as Professor Chris Brown has written recently, representatives from many cultures and dutifully tried to draw on as many sources as possible, the fact is that the resulting document is clearly inspired by the political thought of the West. I would say the Christian thought of the West more than any other aspect. He wrote that in Practical Judgment of International Political Theory. He also points out that many of these rights and those in subsequent covenants and conventions are claimed by cosmopolitan liberals as the product of liberalism, but that many others would claim that they were directly linked to Christian values. The Jewish French legal scholar and later Nobel laureate René Cassin was one of the Human Rights Commission charged in 1945 with drafting the Universal Declaration, he later wrote about this and said that all human beings should act towards each other in a spirit of brotherhood, corresponded, the words in the Universal Declaration, corresponded to the injunction in Leviticus to love thy neighbour as thyself. He noted that thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal in the commandments are merely different ways of expressing the right to life and the right to property. Furthermore, it seems to me that the very concept of fundamental laws, antecedent and superior to positive law, demands an acceptance, logically and ultimately, of natural law. There has to be, if there is to be, laws which are antecedent and superior to positive law, a foundation. And that foundation, it seems to me, comes from the reality. Christianity says that man is a product of being in the image of God. Both the interpretation of human rights and the fact that Europe in general accepts the separation of the state from religion leads to some necessary reflection on the 20 million or so Muslims who live in Europe. There's a deep need to reassess how we apply our obligation for tolerance in the light of racism, aggravated by unemployment and economic dislocation in these recessionary times. There is also need for clarity in our thinking in regard to what is appropriate to demand from migrants of a different religious background in terms of the protection of Europe's shared values. In other words, if I claim, as I do, that the values that we must support are the Christian values, is this a threatening proclamation in terms of Muslims living with us? Many Muslims coming to Europe have no experience of the separation of church and state. Going back to Bernard Lewis, he explains that only in Christendom did God and Caesar coexist in the state, albeit with considerable development, variety, and sometimes conflict in the relations between them. The essential point is that there is no human legislative power in Islam. Another aspect of the Islamic religion that is different is the fact that identity is linked inextricably to religion. And while there is a sense, in some places, of national identity, the nation-state doesn't generally have the same meaning in North Africa or parts of Asia that are Muslim as in Europe. Their faith does have a defining quality. Recognizing these differences and addressing the issues of multiculturalism on the 7th of February 2008 at the Royal Court of Justice, Dr. Rowan Williams made the point that through time the Muslim generally has assumed something of a dual identity, as a citizen and as a believer within the community of the faithful. With many that is true. Therefore there is an acceptance by many Muslims of plurality and the existence of state laws. But it must be accepted that some find this more difficult than others. He then argues that our laws should take account of a religious rationale for behaviours and suggests the examination of the provision of a supplementary jurisdiction, but that could not in any way impair the rights given to other citizens or to punish its members for claiming these rights. Even allowing for this qualification, it seems to me that the very idea of a supplementary jurisdiction, which permits of its recognition in areas of communal religious discipline, is not a good one. It is fraught with the danger of exacerbating differences or tensions between those who come from the embedded culture of Europe, and particularly Muslim migrants. Surely what we must do in our laws is to provide the maximum degree of freedom for people to express themselves, whether in speech, dress, or otherwise, in a manner consistent with the core values which we have. and which are contained in the Convention of Human Rights. Equality of the sexes, for an example, has to be assured. On the other hand, in my opinion, the banning of a headscarf that doesn't cover the face cannot be justified as some extension of this equality between the sexes. Nor should the wearing of a cross or a crescent cause offence. We must not pragmatically seek to force conformity with our society's practices, except where that conformity is a necessary expression of our fundamental beliefs. Just as Christianity stood up for freedom rather than civic or political institutionalism in the past, it now is obliged to stand up for the freedom of other religions against an increasingly intolerant tendency. The claim that Christianity continues to have a legitimate voice in the continuing construction of Europe is not therefore an assertion that Christianity should be treated more favorably than other religions. Religions are protected equally under our treaties. To conclude, Europe has given a great deal to the world, just as it has permitted historically injustice and heinous acts such as the Holocaust. Christianity, however, remains a key repository of our values. It has largely inspired the most noble political initiative that we've known, which to me is the European movement. This is the process of integrating the peoples of Europe. Nationalism was only a recent phenomenon. It only came into existence about 200 years ago. It's been sustained more by myth than by history. It may be a futile exercise to seek to remove nationalistic feelings, but surely we can mitigate their worst effects. I think that European countries collectively and separately adhere to the same set of values. I believe them to be largely inspired by Christianity, whether recognized or not. I think we've created instruments and institutions which help us to live together, and to undermine them and not to continue with their development would be a wrong move. The process of integration probably now faces an existential moment. I wrote this some days ago. I'm honored by the fact that Mrs. Merkel apparently repeated that precise statement today. It is challenged, according to her and according to me, to either integrate or to disintegrate. There's no middle course. There's no minimalist solution that I can find to the economic dilemmas that we now face in the Eurozone. This will require statesmanship and vision. And although semi-detached from this, regrettably, by being outside the Eurozone, Britain will have to play a part. And I hope that it plays a constructive and positive part, rather than trying to stop the onward march by those who have to do it, of the integration to which I referred. In final conclusion, Pope John Paul on the fourth Sunday of Easter, on the 2nd of May 2004, welcomed the enlargement of the EU to Central Eastern Europe as follows. In these days, Europe is reaching another important landmark in its history. 10 new countries are entering the European Union, 10 nations, which by culture and tradition were and felt European. They now belong to this union of states. However, if the unity of the European peoples is to endure, it cannot be merely economic and political. As I had the opportunity to recall during my pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, November 1982, if the soul of Europe is still united today, the reason is that it refers to common human and Christian values. Only a Europe that does not eliminate but rediscover its Christian roots will be able to take up the challenges of the third millennium, peace, intercultural and interreligious dialogue, the safeguarding of creation. All believers in Christ of the European West and East are required to make their own contribution through open and sincere ecumenical cooperation. So he might have gone on to say, Europe must have more than a market. It must have a soul. Thank you very much.
Sutherland has said very kindly that he'll take a couple of questions. I've got about 45, but I will hold back. Perhaps you'd just like to identify yourself when you ask the question. There's one gentleman on the right over there.
Good evening, Sutherland. I'm Russell from Newman. Thank you very much for that insightful talk. I wanted to know your views. Given the successes and failures of the European project, what are the prospects for further integration in blocs like Mercosur and ASEAN, and what are the steps that they should and should not take?
Well, I think each has to be taken on its own merits. I think that if I'm right in saying that you have to share values, you have to share, in a way, a religious heritage, I think that that's very helpful. I think the Asian situation is quite different. And I think there, the creation of a common market is as much as one can expect. And indeed, surprisingly, although they do share everything, Mercosur countries have a very long way to go in terms of their attitudes to each other. And didn't have the impetus that Europe had through the appalling destruction of 2 world wars, which incited the initial move in a way. So I'm hopeful that both can be helpful in terms of reducing tensions between people and opening borders, but I don't see them moving anything like as fast or as far as we've done in Europe. I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Michael Grafton, fascinating, thank you. You used the word several times in the European context, integration, and then you added on by sharing sovereignty. Federalism, a word you used a lot, and you once used federal union. They're all
Federal union.
They're all relative terms, perhaps. Can I just give a little story? My brother and I are both Roman Catholics. We were both born of a Belgian mother and an Anglo-Irish father, totally irrelevant, but same background, and we argue viciously, I won't say which way it goes, about the European idea. And it normally boils down to a lack of understanding of what those terms mean that I described. Can you help me?
Well, I hope I can a little bit. For what they mean for me is that certain elements of governance which require Europe, because of our interdependence with each other, to have common positions, can only be achieved and secured by supranational institutions. And the most obvious supranational institution is the Commission itself, where however much it is abused, each commissioner takes an oath that he will put Europe before his own country. And certainly in my commission, at least, the vast bulk of the commissioners did that. And therefore came forward with policies that were in the European interest. But that's only a trivial aspect of it. The supranational power of a law, that is, once a law is adopted, that it can be enforced through a court that will enforce through national courts its judgments, as in the Factortame case and many others in other jurisdictions, the supremacy of European law over national law. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights is completely different from that, even though the European Union has now adopted it as an instrument. I'd get into too much complication about that. Much of the debate here, which is often referred to as a European debate, is about judgments made by the European Council, the Council of Europe, through the Convention on Human Rights. I'm not talking about that. That's fundamental. I'm talking about the supremacy of community law, European Union law. I'm talking about majority voting in the Council of Ministers, where countries, as is the case currently, a significant number of areas of activity can be outvoted, and laws can be made over the objection of an individual member state. That's clearly federalism. There are a whole range, therefore, of different areas where the European Parliament operates now with increasing powers as a mechanism which has to be consulted and approve the making of laws. It does so not on the basis of national positions, but on the basis of votes of the European Parliament, and parliamentary structures and groups. So I think it's in a whole range of different areas where intergovernmentalism, which I think does not work, is the old game of discussion between capitals, which has broken down so many times in the past, and which has always been based on balancing interests and shifting alliances, which I don't think works, and it won't work here. So the structures and the institutions are what it's about.
Yes, gentlemen, about a third way from the right. You put your right hand up. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sutherland. My name is Conor Gallant, and I'm a fellow Irishman as well. And I was particularly intrigued to hear what you had to say about nationalism and the fact that it was invented only really about 200 years ago. And in the context of your understanding of nationalism, would you say that the rejection of the proposed European Constitution was as a result of that sort of negative nationalism? And the other question I'd like to ask you as well is, given that we now have the Lisbon Treaty, do you think the Lisbon Treaty adequately protects those values of subsidiarity and of personalism and of
Solidarity.
Yes, indeed. Do you think that the Lisbon Treaty is a sufficiently robust framework with which to protect those values into the future? And how do you think that's going to interact with the issue of Turkey and a possible integration of Turkey into the European Union?
Well, first of all, there are a lot of questions in that. First of all, with regard to nationalism, I think the votes on the Lisbon Treaty and the original treaty are difficult to understand without a detailed analysis of polling afterwards. Basically, the Dutch voted because of a tide washing over the country in the area of migration, which had led to the disintegration of political parties, violence and so on, and the country that was the most liberal in Europe turning almost overnight into something quite different. The French vote was an amalgam, no doubt some related to sovereignty, but that certainly didn't produce the majority. A lot voted against Chirac. If you can vote no and kick your prime minister in the teeth, and there's no ostensible price for voting no, you will vote no, and they did. The Polish plumber, God knows what. I think the most informative of the referenda, needless to remark, because of our high intelligence, was that in Ireland. And what I found particularly interesting in that, it's a serious point actually, is that a populist sort of, and there was a fair bit of the stuff that you get in the media here, which unfortunately in the red tops is the same media that we get with Irish editions in Dublin, led by Murdoch-like antagonism to Europe and so on, were hammering the same old shibboleths and so on that one hears all the time here. And they won with a populist vote against. And you may say, well, how did the second vote happen? Well, they said it happened because we got frightened. People frightened us. That's what they said as justification for the change. It wasn't the case. The second vote was won, in my view, because a group of people, largely from outside the political process, and some of the departments of state, most particularly the Department of Foreign Affairs, worked on producing information and selling facts. And the thing was explained. And when it was explained, there was this incredible change, where we ended up with 66 or 67% voting in favour. That gives me confidence that if the thing was really debated here, the British people in particular, who are tolerant to a fault, would see all the pluses in it. And every time I've heard a real debate here, I've been amazed by the number of people who at the end of a debate are convinced, at least by the positive value of the whole thing. So, as to the Turkish question, for me, Turkey should and could become a member of the European Union. I think we're committed to their membership, but not at any cost. I'm not talking about financial cost. And I said this in a speech in Istanbul 2 weeks ago. Either they commit themselves and prove themselves to live to the values which I have been discussing, including the dignity and equality of man and so on, in a way which gives us an assurance that they will continue to do so, or I'm against. And I must say that some of the debate here alienates the pro-Europeans, because it seems as if, with some in the British political scene, the idea of enlargement is a good idea in principle, because it dilutes the whole. But we cannot dilute the principles. I agree with Turkey therefore being a member, and I'm in favour of it, publicly in favour of it, but not at the price of Turkey becoming a member without unambiguous commitment to the values which we have been proclaiming here.
One last question, well, two. The gentleman I called before, who was John. Yes.
Thank you. David Cohen, Fellow St. John. In listening to your very uplifting and persuasive remarks, it would seem very ill-mannered candle, but following particularly on the comments of the previous gentleman, I am inclined, nonetheless, to candle a little. That is to say, that if one is putting forward the European Union and the great European project which you described with such enthusiasm as having or needing a soul of some kind, then that does mean to say that conduct of that body has to be based upon a rather better developed sense of morality. What I have in mind there in particular is that morality has to cultivate a number of virtues among its leaders and directors, one of which is trust. And with respect to your recent comments, that trust seems to have been remarkably absent both among the European Commission and also among the leaders of the member states who have repeatedly refrained from consulting their electors when it comes to joining the Euro and making further progress in terms of Maastricht and Lisbon and all the other treaties. In those few occasions when they are trusted to give a response, they are told they've got it wrong and they have to go back and try again until they get it right. With respect, it simply won't do to pick apart elections, which are always flawed, always generated in their result by all kinds of conflicting, often unseemly desires, and say, well, the ones that vote this way obviously due to these harmful factors, and the enlightened people voted yes, and that's to be approved of. You've got to trust the people, the fundamental aspect of democracy, which is, I think, a moral virtue, however partial and flawed it may be, does reside in trust. That trust does seem to be lacking in the EU and in those who propose it, and is markedly lacking among Appalachians like Mr. Barroso, whose comments seem to be a rather contemptuous kind in relation to those who question decisions not to have referenda or to repeat referenda seems to be rather deplorable. I do think that if Europe's going to go forward further, it's got to have the trust and backing of the ordinary people, however flawed, ignorant, prejudiced, and bigoted they may be.
Well, I absolutely disagree with some aspects of what you said for the following reason. Anybody who seriously argues that the Treaty of Lisbon should have been put to a referendum is, in my view, living in a world of make-believe. It is about 330 articles, which are extremely complicated. It goes virtually nowhere in terms of the great leap forward. It's quite different from joining the Euro, which I can concede is a relatively black or white issue. But to put everything that is a treaty to a national vote and referendum runs quite contrary to the British parliamentary tradition, who opposed it most vigorously. But ironically, or cynics might say from a different purpose, the referenda in the case of the conventional constitution were initiated by Mr. Blair's, putting it up more or less to everybody else, followed down the road by Mr. Chirac and so on. It was never a constitution. It was never appropriate for a referendum. And what ultimately came out, the Treaty of Lisbon, could not be properly debated in a way that would allow for a referendum to take place. I think in or out, is an appropriate subject for a referendum. I think in or out of the euro is an appropriate subject for a referendum. But other than that black and white issue, or the issue of sharing sovereignty in the area of defence, for an example, would be a black or white issue for me. But other than that, the tinkering with the system that can be explained as being the most horrific innovation, as it has been consistently by many in the press and in the Eurosceptic arguments in Parliament here, nobody now can even remember what was in the Single European Act or the various treaty amendments that we've had since. Nobody can remember what they were all about, and yet they were being told only months previously that they were going to bring about a permanent destruction of their way of life. I mean, it's ludicrous. The debate in Ireland on the Lisbon Treaty, some of the arguments were absolutely absurd. Most of them were without any foundation whatsoever. So I think parliamentary democracy demands that parliaments take their responsibility in the vast bulk of cases, and in other cases only when the issue is very serious and very simple is a referendum the right way to proceed.
Jeremy.
Jeremy Stark, Kitchley Foundation. Peter, that was a marvellous statement of the importance of values within the European Union and in the eyes of people as they judge who they want to govern them. But a consonance of values is not a sufficient condition for a federal union. There have to be many other things that work. One of them is a shared identity, which is different from values. Another is just a consonance of hard interests. And I think the British are more honest than many other European peoples about feeling that if you scratch the surface and go below it in the personalities of each European citizen and ask them to choose which government they would like to have if they could have no other, they would be very reluctant to give up their local or national government. They like the spread of choice in the European Union, which does some things well at a certain level. But many peoples will be extremely reluctant to put everything in the hands of Brussels. How do you get around that to create the power, the trust, the authority of a central union government that would deal with those feelings at the democratic level?
Well, you're absolutely right, Jeremy, of course, in what you say, and that's the fundamental flaw, fundamental issue. I suppose what I've been trying to say is that this identity of scratching the surface and I am British, or is it I am English, or is it am I Welsh, or Irish, or French, am I a Walloon, am I a Belgian, am I a Bavarian, am I a German? Very complicated issues, and issues that have been built up and fermented by the national zeal that is needed to fight great wars, and the illusions and myths that are part of the history that we all have, where all our history books are different. And it's precisely that the European Union, I believe, is constructed to fight against. And I believe that what I've inadequately been trying to say is that we have an identity which transcends our nationality. I mean, I'll fight and roar as much as the next man when an Irish rugby team takes the field against England, and cry with joy when it beats them, hopefully occasionally. But I have no, and I know I work similarly with Wales, but I know that doesn't stop me being a European, and it doesn't stop me having a basic suspicion that nationalism is about superiority. If you scratch the surface, as you say, with the average person and ask them what do they think of the Spaniards, they'll have a caricature in their mind. And they'll talk about the Spanish Inquisition, which was hardly today or yesterday, and in numerical terms is of a minor, relatively minor blemish in the total appalling history of this continent. If you talk about Italians, you'll be told they can't be trusted, or the Irish that they're drunk all the time, or whatever. We have so many caricatures which are part of the nationalism, which I hate. And I think the only way that we can fight against it is by developing things, new things, difficult ideas, and that's certainly what these founders thought, because they've just gone through it all. But we can't do it by sitting around talking about the commercial advantage of being in a market without talking about something more profound, that we're all human beings together, and that we're on an old continent which has been a cockpit of conflict for generations, and it's time we changed.
Can I follow up?
Oh, yes.
Last question. Can I just follow up Jeremy's point? You said that one thing you'd be totally against is sharing sovereignty in the area of defence. There's no problem for me.
Today?
Today. No problem for me. No problem for Jeremy. We've been members of NATO for years. Partly a result of our national history, even though I'm half Irish. Partly a result of your national history as an Irishman, but you're against that.
I'm ashamed of it. I'd love to be in NATO.
But there it is.
Yeah.
Now, think of economic policy today. The main fund which has been established to support the euro has been established using the intergovernmental method. Why? Because the German Bundestag wouldn't trust the Assemblée Nationale with economic governance in the European Union. And the reasons for that are that Germany has, for cultural, for historical reasons, and its own attitude to economic policy, its own attitude to inflation. President Sarkozy and the Assemblée Nationale take a rather different view. So, isn't the point that Jeremy and I would both share, it might be ploddingly prosaic in a typically British way, but isn't there a huge kernel of truth in it? That we want to push integration where it will work, where you can make it accountable, but there are limits beyond which you can't push it without discrediting democratic politics.
Well, I might have expected a sting in the tail, but and it's the greatest one of all. We are the only pragmatists in Europe. I've heard it before. And of course, there is an element of truth in it, but pragmatism, I think, only gets us so far. You're quite right about the recent events, but they exploded on us so quickly, and we haven't had time to digest the consequences of not providing the support to Greece, the collapse of the bankruptcy of a European economy within the Eurozone, the effect on the Euro itself, the effect on the world, the effect on European integration. I think the German Bundestag, if it had time to reflect on this, or the French Assemblée Nationale, might well have taken more cautious approaches in regard to positions that they took vis-à-vis each other, and Sarkozy and Merkel might also. So I think we're living through a storm at the moment, and how we come out of it, I think we'll come out of it with more federalism rather than less, but I may be wrong. If we come out with less, I think we'll end up with a badly wounded, if not hold below the waterline, European Union. And of course there are differences, but there are differences between Scotland, between Edinburgh and London. There are differences between the north of England and London. There are differences between regions everywhere, and we've learned how to handle them. And I just don't accept the definition of national position that people have. I think we are all bigger than being national people. I can't stand our position in regard to NATO. I consider that we should have joined NATO on day one. It was all a ridiculous position in regard to Northern Ireland and the requirement in joining NATO of accepting the borders of every state, which at that time, of course, we didn't accept that Northern Ireland wasn't within the state of Ireland, so to speak, that stopped us. But why am I getting into that apologia pro vita sua, as Newman would have put it? I don't know. But I suppose it's the only way to end after that spiteful question.